Thank you very much for all those 4 introductions. I'll stay over here because I have a microphone here. We can open this up to questions on the floor already, if I see any. I see one.
Your content now isn't the end of something, it's the start of a conversation. And that makes me realize that this content is actually constantly evolving and developing in the context of other content that's evolving and developing at the same time. So it's not sequential. You've read something, it's done, now you go on to read something else. So can you talk a bit more about what dynamic there might be about this? In other words, the fact that you keep coming back to revisit these things, and so do other people. And how does that change the shape of your content over time?
The content itself does change. It does evolve. Quite often, stories get updated, but also in a more organic sense, content, it might not be growing on your site, at your organization site, but it is growing out there in digital media. So quite often, stories will develop in that interaction with each other, but also in that interaction with the audience, with the people formerly known as readers, with whoever it is that is engaging with that content. So quite often you can actually see things evolve, not just with the organization where the original content was placed, but in a sort of much wider conversation, and that conversation absolutely includes people who are consuming the content rather than creating it.
In many ways, the news organizations used to employ news editors to do this, and now the consumer has in many ways become the news editor. The news professionals are looking at the users to follow the development of a story through its natural life, whether that's just for half an hour or 24 hours or a week or forever. The consumers are influencing us much more.
And maybe I could add on that you could consider the users as journalists as well, because they're helping you with the story. So if you need some information about something that's going on, you make a traditional story, and then you ask for help, and you'll get help. And then the story, in a way, would be the user's story, but written by a professional at the newsroom.
And readers challenge you all much more than in the past. And it can be very blunt and rude, quite often insulting. But quite often in those insults, you can actually find a grain of genuine argument.
That is actually something that I would also pass on to Alison and Paul. So, you as the 2 publishers in this round, all of you basically said there is more of a conversation between the journalists and the readers or content consumers. Trinity Mirror, especially the things that you showed, especially these newer things that you guys are trying out, they kind of seem to lean over a little bit more towards entertainment in some cases, just engagement and keeping people, yes, entertained. Do you go primarily for that entertainment and friendly conversation with people, or do you try to insert information as well?
Yeah, okay. So some of the things I showed there they're quite light-hearted, but they are experiments to get to deeper kind of areas. So our data unit, for example, whose work I didn't give examples of because they're headed by somebody else, but they will quite often take really serious, not that interesting data on the surface of it and start trying to dig it out. And that's when the conversation starts with the audience, as in you will see somebody from that unit saying, this PDF is just a nightmare to try and get the figures out of. And at that point, the data community will start coming back with solutions. And so right from the start, the kind of conversation develops. And then you start to publish it, and you have to make it relevant to people. So, taking it down to postcode level, making it searchable. With World War I data, people could search their street and get names of people who died in the street in the Great War. It's adding context, I think, to information, and sometimes it's fun stuff, but you do the fun stuff to get people's attention so you can draw them into more deep things.
Yeah, in our at the traditional website, we would targeting people which are 20 plus. And then, of course, we would target them with traditional, more or less traditional information. One example, in Sweden, they have a big challenge about the refugees. They had 15 fires going on at refugee centers in Sweden. And we were, of course, doing a lot of stories about that and doing a lot of interactive graphics and things like that where people could get more information. But when we go to the younger people in Dig Out, which is the one I presented as well, is we are targeting people between 13 and 20. And then we would communicate with them in a totally different way and a more popular way and a more entertaining way, even if we should do subjects like refugees centers on fire in Sweden.
Is that something, so this conversation with the audience, how far does you, Rachel, also describe that in terms of research or finding sources, and in preparation for some probably more longer pieces? How does that actually work for an agency and for the sports side of things? I would imagine that is less easy.
Yes, it can be, but I'm quite lucky in that I have about 1,000 customers around the world who do not hesitate, people like Paul here, who do not hesitate to let me know if I'm not doing something properly or if I'm not doing it in the correct way. So I have that level of customer opinion and view where, on a larger scale, NBC or the BBC will phone the chief executive of AB to comment on something that we're doing. At my level, it'll be a sports editor of a newspaper in Thailand will phone up and want to have a chat about something. But as you say, now it is developing into much more of a down-to-earth conversation with users. And my best reporters are actively encouraging this. We have our writers take part in Google chats and in AMAs on Reddit. And that just stirs up the conversation and gets people in sport, gets people furious usually. People seem to get very annoyed about sport all the time, and that's one. So at that level, the conversation takes place there as well.
That is actually an interesting point. So, sports is usually emotional because you're either for this team or against this team. But the other examples that you guys mentioned were race or gender related sometimes, the conversations that come up in social media and that go around. When you encourage such a conversation, how do you keep it civil? How do you deal with it? Or is that not a problem for most of you?
I think that's one of the biggest challenges, and I don't think that many media organisations have worked that out, or even are taking it that seriously. So I've worked a lot with The Guardian, and they actually have figured out how to keep conversations civil, which is that they have human moderators whose sole job it is to look at the comments below the line and, obviously get rid of the ones that are offensive. They have very, very clear guidelines. Comments are removed because they're in breach of the guidelines. And what happens eventually is that people start to self-police, or the community self-polices, in that you know what you can and can't say. So you stop saying things that are offensive. But it is a massive problem. I know that a lot of women have stopped commenting because of it, because there is a misogyny that's very particular and very prevalent in online comments. And I know a lot of people won't engage with their community of commentators, of below the line comments, precisely for that reason. They don't want to wade through the hostility to get to something that might actually be relevant.
Yeah, in my belief, the best moderators are people which are in the discussion. which are taking part of it. And we have created a system which is very simple, that you should just push a button, and then the moderator would directly go to this part of what's going on. And then, because people are crazy when they are debating, they are offending everybody at any time. So you have to have moderation going on for 24/7. And I think this should be one of the things which are different between Facebook, Twitter, and a traditional media company running a discussion, because we are moderating what is going on.
Yeah, we have post-moderation approach to things, so things are published and then there's a report system on our sites. We don't have moderators actively in there all the time. But what we do find, and which I think is really important, is that if, for example, on Facebook, if somebody starts to kick off around a story and the brand goes back in, not necessarily the reporter, but on the brand account, so the brand goes back in and starts saying why a particular story was taken that way, or in, for example, the coverage of an inquest where you may get people who just think that the report itself is made up in some way and doesn't reflect their understanding of how that person was and how they died. We need to get back in there and actually challenge people and say what the facts are, because at that point the conversation doesn't go into the wild. You leave it alone and more people will join it and it will be amplified. So I think really, I feel quite strongly about this, newsrooms have got to be mature enough to say they will engage below the line and be a part of it, because otherwise it becomes the wilderness and it's really nasty.
I asked a lot of questions, so I see one over here and one there. Why don't we start over here? Just a second.
Question for Alison, but also for the rest of the panel. It's Robin Pembroke from the BBC. You talked about maps and storytelling and how that was really popular. And I wondered whether you also had experiences, or whether others did as well, around using location-based data standards in how you gather the news. And so, for example, we use Data Miner, the Twitter-associated product for spotting breaking stories.
So we use Geophedia for kind of putting a circle around an area and finding out the social comments within that. And we've just, although I haven't tried it yet, moved into GeoWave to experiment with that. Obviously, a lot of our TweetDeck searches will be location-specific and built either around an area or around kind of lat long to deal with things on that. Obviously, people's Twitter profiles give you a lot of detail if they've put their locations on, and I think most people on Instagram have no idea that they are telling people exactly where they are at any 1 second. So you can get a lot of information from the metadata of pieces of information. So we do try and train people around that. Of course, the flip side is on that, but what we really need to be moving into now is training our journalists around when that metadata has to come out and when it actually isn't appropriate to just push something out on social media with all that kind of backroom noise that tells people more information that you might want to. It's not so vital for us in the regionals, but you know, at your level, I can imagine that's really important. Does that answer your question?
Thank you.
Does anybody else want to have a...
Then I saw another question up here.
Hi, John Evans from Transtel. This is a totally non-technical question. It's more to do with, certainly in the world of professional football and politicians, you're sort of given a barrier between you and them by the PR machine. So what is the way of challenging not taking the PR spin that they want you to have and producing fair and balanced and interesting content?
I think in sporting terms, I think we've more or less given up on professional football. Direct contact with managers and getting those. There was a time when football managers were famous for being blunt and saying unfashionable things, and now it's the total opposite. The managers and players are completely schooled in every word that they say, and they're generally encouraged to be bland and uncontroversial, unlike a certain London-based manager at the moment who seems to be. trying hard to provide stories. And Mourinho actually is the Chelsea manager, for anyone who doesn't realise, is an interesting point in that he appears to be trying to manipulate the media in certain directions, and sometimes succeeds, sometimes fails disastrously, and is generally getting it quite wrong. But on the whole, it's nigh on impossible to be pursuing an accurate voice from officialdom. We rely intensively on people speaking off the record, and we have procedures in place where I have to know who the source is. Generally, we often need two sources for a piece of interesting information. But if I'm told, look, the source is Mourinho, or it's the player's agent, or it's the player himself, but he's talking off the record, then that's often the only way that we can stand stories up these days.
Just a short one. In sports and entertainment, it's impossible to get close to anybody without having their managers or PR people making the contacts. But in politics, it's something totally different in my country, because politicians want to badmouth about everybody. So you should just use traditional journalistic way of doing this, going to the opponent, to this person who wants to get into your paper or your website with a certain thing. So that's journalism in traditional way.
So we got banned in Newcastle for about 6 months with the Newcastle Chronicle. They disagreed with something that had been written, and that was it. Nobody would talk. Kind of persona non grata at the stadium, and it was great because it became fan-first football writing. So it was not manager says on Thursday I want to win on Saturday, or striker says I want to score more goals this year than ever. All that bollocks. It was actually stuff that people wanted to read about, and took off the shackles, if you like, around kind of doing really hard-hitting investigations that sometimes sport will say, actually, I think that might be a news story, because sport don't want to jeopardise relationships, and even though they're kind of best placed to have the contacts. The only place I think that we probably do have a really great relationship still, and that's a legacy thing, is Liverpool and Everton, because it just goes back for so far. But most of the others were like, well, they're like any other business, and they are publishing their own content, and they see us as rivals.
That's a really interesting comment. Sometimes constraints give rise to innovation. Does that mean you guys, were banned from it and never went back, or have you guys, now that you probably have access again, reverted a little bit back to that?
Yeah, eventually there was a kind of a peace deal made. But it was very much on the understanding things could never go back the way that they were. The Rubicon had been crossed, and Newcastle newsroom had found a better way of covering and relating to the people that they were writing for.
This is a real problem around the UK, everywhere at the moment. Football clubs are boycotting the press. It's happened recently in Swindon, Gillingham, even smaller clubs where traditionally the relationship has been a lot more intense, are taking offence a lot more easily. I'd just like to add that I was looking at an email exchange this morning where we've been offered a multi-platform interview with Cristiano Ronaldo, which is fantastic. But there was only one caveat: not allowed to talk about football.
So did you pass that on to your entertainment team?
I passed it on nowhere.
Thank you. I saw another question over there. Evan.
Hi, I'm Evan Sandhouse. I'm with the New York Times on the technical side. And my question is motivated somewhat by my own experience and some of the things that you were saying up there. You've spoken quite a lot about the audience moving into sort of a new role in its relationship with an organization's reporting. But I've also noticed a trend of people in the organizations who are not in traditional editorial roles contributing in new ways, given how things have shifted at the Times. I know we have some non-editorial folks working on various social media feeds and stuff like that, and I'm wondering if that dynamic is present in your organizations as well.
Yeah, Exactly, because you have journalists in the organization who wants to be on Twitter before they are in the New York Times own website. And to us, it's sometimes a problem because then they're focusing too much to be the number one with the news on Twitter instead of focusing on what we are paying them for. But on the other hand, we want people to share their stories everywhere. So what we have decided is that you should share with your users on our website as number one, and then as the second thing you're doing is sharing with your Twitter profile or your Facebook profile.
Just add to that. I mean, I don't want to be snobby about it, and I'm freelance, so I don't want to name any names either. But I think you're in trouble if you have an imbalance where you do need to make sure there's enough editorial weight in that room, that there are enough people who are coming from editorial. Because I think if you don't have that as a core, then you're going to stray into areas that you might not want to stray into as a news organization. Working with Jazeera last year, I was doing a lot of the sort of convergence stuff between TV and online, and a lot of that was just about so encouraging the excellent correspondence that they have all over the world, but they weren't really utilizing them for digital. So, getting the longest serving Iraqi correspondent, Jane Araf, to do a Reddit, which was huge. I mean, it was Reddit's #1 for days, exactly at the point when Islamic State took over Mosul. There she was, answering everybody's questions. Or getting correspondents to maybe just post a little clip on social media of something that hasn't been finished, that hasn't gone through the editing process yet, just a little teaser of a package that's to come, getting them to use Instagram and Twitter to post images of wherever it is that they've been, getting them to post content that isn't necessarily about the story but is pertinent to the area that they are in. All those kind of things, I think, just build so much more engagement and are not necessarily things that a TV newsroom is thinking about.
All right, thank you for that. I see another question over here, and I see one microphone there and another one there.
Thank you. I'm Adrian Michaels of First Word Media. Question for Paul. You were talking about the younger audience and how you engage them with regard to the refugee crisis and whatever. I just want to know how you were targeting 13 to 20-year-olds, and I'd like to know how old the people who are doing the targeting and producing the material are, and have any of us got a hope in hell?
They're not in the 50s like me. And they would be like, 20 to 25. But of course it's a problem targeting people on 13 if you're 20. So we have interns coming from high schools, traditional schools, just to bring them in and doing stories. We have a lot of interns coming from they're 14, 15, and for 1 week every year they have to practice somewhere if they want to be a painter or a journalist or a priest. They could, and then they come to us and we use them and we let them communicate with the users on Dig Out, which is called. You're old when you're 20.
Great, that's not very encouraging.
Any other questions in the audience? There's one.
Thank you. I'm Scott Calder. I'm from Mainstream Data. This may be a heretical question. I've heard two themes here. First of all, that quality is extraordinarily important. And the second thing I've heard is that driven by the rapid advancements of technology and the flattening of the journalistic world, if you will, more direct communication from and participation by contributors and users, these two seem to almost be in conflict in the sense that you're not going to be able to have the same rigid quality control on user-generated content that you have on your own. And in fact, there's charm in some of the video, for example, which is less professional, I think we heard. The question is, if you look out to the future with this trend, what is the role of the traditional news agency when more and more of the content is generated by non-professional journalists, and maybe you serve only a curation role?
So if you could just write down the answer to that question on a little piece of paper, and I'll take it back to my office with me. No, I think obviously we don't have the answers. One answer from my point of view is exclusivity is doing it well. In the part that's played by the journalist has to be done extremely well. So my point earlier about a traditional gamer, a match report, is valid in that the game report, more or less anyone can write it, and these days they do. They write it all over the world. What people don't do, and they don't have access to, is an exclusive story, the ability to work sources, the ability to come up on a daily basis with something that is compelling, exclusive, and is going to get clicks. I inject 9 or 10 stories to the AP Corporate Sports Twitter account every day, and I see the immediate feedback in terms of clicks, and the exclusive stories get views, they get clicked on. It's massively relevant, easy to see that an exclusive story about FIFA will immediately be hit by a few thousand people, whereas a match report about a football game that's just finished will be a few dozen, or barely into 3 figures. So for me, that tells the story.
I picked this up and then I realised it's a really hard question, but I do have a view on it, which is I think you're always going to have storytellers. There've always been storytellers. But if you are a professional trained journalist, then you curate, you verify, you sort the signal from the noise, you add layers of information, you put that information back, you see what happens, you take it, you reflect on it, and you throw it forward again. So I do think that the role of kind of the traditional journalist is evolving hugely, and so is the skill set. You know, it's completely different. But that ability as well of being able to have a salary whereby somebody says, go and sit in that court all day on the off chance that something may happen at the end of it, or go and sit in that borough council meeting because there's a really big planning application coming up that affects the community. You know, having people who do that for a living and who are trained to do it takes a lot of pressure off. You know, I know a lot of very good hyper-local bloggers, but they're either doing it as a sideline or they're, you know, kind of trying to make a living from what essentially, you know, a labour of love. So I do think that, you know, we have smaller newsrooms than we used to, but then when I started, there was a guy in the newsroom whose one job was to write the opinion every day, and nobody ever read it anyway. So you know, that kind of thing, that goes by the wayside. What you're left with is like the kernel of journalism, I think, and then also around it, some of the fun stuff that brings people in.
I don't have the answer as well, but my belief is that we should dare being journalists and there being media companies, which means that we are not only Facebook light. Facebook are better interacting with people, but we are media companies. And that means that we should know what quality means to our users. And that's why we're doing this project, because we're not doing an opinion leader every day if people don't want to read it. Then we should do something else, which means something to our users. So we should know what quality is in a modern digital world, and then we should, of course, act as journalists which are verifying news, which are not just bringing news to anybody at any time without knowing if this is right. We should not do doing all this copy-paste journalism, which is the worst thing about what's going on at the moment, that everybody are copy-pasting anybody at any time without checking any information in what they are copy-pasting. They're just quoting another media. So be journalists. It's not that. It's not simple, but it's a way to do it.
All right. Here's one more question. While we
that you can tell what they're reading.
Yeah, exactly. That's the difference between the newspapers and nowadays. You can tell.
Yeah.
What they're reading.
Paul, you mentioned something, you just talked about the quality project that you introduced earlier. And I remember writing down a little note to myself here. I just wanted to know, how long did it take you guys to actually come up with that formula? How long did it take to discuss that and argue over it and agree on it?
But this is only a beta version.
Okay.
Yeah, this is the first step. We've been doing this for half a year, only in the sports department. Now we're going to do it in our investigative journalism department, and that means probably that the figures would be something else, because reading time would probably go up in our investigative journalism, and that would be much more important than having a lot of readers. So they should read this very long. And then we have, you know, our paid content. It's in the paid content is of course sales, which is the thing instead of page views. So we are changing and trying to get this quality model, and we are changing everything anytime. And that's a part of the new world, that you're never reaching the goal of what you're doing. You have to change all the time.
How hard was it to evangelize that kind of thinking within the organization?
It is hard, but you know, it's we changed from a traditional newspaper, which have traditional newspaper journalists, into a digital organization, and this is young people. They want to know what quality is, and we have to learn them, and we have to listen to them what they mean quality is to our users.
You all, in one way or another, mentioned that reading time, or time that people spend with a piece of content, you know, is an indicator for engagement and quality. Do you actually find, those of you who are assigning things, or Rachel perhaps more on the receiving side of those assignments, do you actually find there is more investment in longer form pieces? That is kind of picking up again? Or are we not quite there yet? Are we literally just talking about 2 or 3 minutes?
It's very expensive to do long form. Yeah, let's be brutally honest here. You know, I've got a very limited budget. You know, people keep nibbling away at bits here and bits there. If someone comes to me with a project to do something, as someone did recently, to go to West Africa and do something on how sort of the Ebola struck football clubs of Liberia, I think, yeah, great idea, but can you put a cost on it? I see a long flight, I see hotels, I see all kinds of costs involved there. You know, what am I getting? It's an American phrase. Am I getting bang for my buck? Yep. Sometimes and we do try and put a structure on it, in that when it's done well, long form comes out, especially in a multimedia environment, it comes out beautifully. It can be absolute a pleasure to read. I think the New York Times has done some of the finest work in that area in recent years. And every time I always, as a sort of wizened old journalist, I rarely read beyond 200 or 300 words, but I find myself with good long-form journalism being sucked into reading 1,500, 2,000 words. And when you finish it, you think, that was good, because I'm still there, and they've caught my attention. So it's not really an answer, but it's expensive, and it is a luxury, but we do need to do it.
I think we found with metrics now that what we thought were great reads aren't really that important to people. The big double-page feature spread interviews with somebody, they're not connecting. It's just what we always thought people would like. So we're a lot more discerning now about kind of the type of long reads that we'll do. They do work if you get it right. The Manchester Evening News did a very quick turnaround long read with an immersive storytelling around the Manchester Dogs home fire after that was burned to the ground in an arson attack, and off the back of that they raised £1 million in 24 hours. So if you get it right and you can connect with people, they do. But I think a lot of the long reads that we did in print for a long time were kind of vanity publishing, and now we have the very brutal figures that tell us when we can and can't, you know, expect to get return for it.
Yeah, we have for 1.5 years been doing digital paying, which is a freemium model. And we know for sure that people won't pay for crap. They won't pay for things that they could get free everywhere. So we have to create what we consider as skyscraper projects, which are making attention to our paid area with really good journalism, but done in a digital way, in a digital storytelling, which you can do so much more than you can in a newspaper. But people won't pay the price for these projects. We only have, ours is like $5 a month, so you have to get partnerships. So we are creating a Scandinavian digital skyscraper project together with Aftonbladet and VG, which are the two leading newspapers in Norway and Sweden. And together with them, we would create these projects which would give attention to our paid areas digitally. And that's one way to do it.
I mean, I would add to that thing about, I do think it's shifting. I do think that, you know, there was this real trend for digital being comment-driven, and there'd be all these sort of hot takes. And, you know, I'd quite often get called up and asked to write a think piece in an hour, and I'd be thinking, don't you want me to think about it? You know, do you not want me to actually think about this, or just, you know, instead of just churning it out? And I think it, you know, it became a bit like fast food. It's not very filling. You know, you're hungry after 10 minutes. And I think that's how people reacted. So there is, I think, and certainly talking to other organizations, I'm getting a sense that there is a switch away from that. And I also think that, yeah, good journalism is expensive, but you know, we can see that the companies that are leading digital, you look at the New York Times, you look at The Guardian, the New York Times totally invests in its reporters, and it shows. The quality of its international reporting is exemplary, and it is expensive to make, but it is in demand. That's the reason why it's leading in digital. And I think in terms of long form, people do seem to want to read them, but I think you need to think carefully about what it is that you're writing. It's not a standard feature. There are certain things that lend themselves to long form and make them an engaging read. So much more thought into what kind of story it is.
Thank you. We're coming close to the end of our panel discussion. We probably have time for 1 or 2 more questions if there are any. Anyone? Any hands? Marco has a question there.
Marko Kdobelnik from Artificial Intelligence Lab from Slovenia. So one question, I mean, listening to your comments on audience and trying to understand the audience, right? So today we live in this, let's say, big data era where we can get the data, we can analyze them, we can predict and so on. Now, these tools technically, many people are afraid of using these tools, but at the end they are just glasses which you can put and you see better, nothing else, right? So like topics like demand prediction, so to predict where in the long tail, where your primary interest cannot be there just because of too big complexity. Are you thinking of using this kind of tools now or in the future? So would you see these to help you, or would you be, well, afraid, or you're not even aware that this exists?
Okay. We are, of course, doing a lot of investigating in what kind of tools we should use, because in my belief, journalists have to still be journalists and not always just be looking at figures, because we have to do things for people that they didn't believe that they would be interested in as well. But we have dashboards for all the editors where they can follow how a story would go, and if it's placed in the top center and in and other places, is this story creating as it's, or performing as it should do, and then they would move it, of course, to another place. But data is coming into our newsroom, and it will stay there, and we hope to be like Netflix, because Netflix, in my belief, is one of the best in doing this, because they're always giving you something new. When you have seen something, you want to see something more of some similar things. And that's, of course, something that we can use in our journalism as well, and we would be doing that. But our data is still on a basic level compared to what Facebook, Twitter, and especially Netflix are able to do. But we will catch up, hopefully.
Yeah, I am a bit scared, I have to say, of when I hear tales from other newsrooms, in the UK anyway, of screens hanging over desks, giving live updates to the success of a story, and stories being assigned according to the success of that program, and people being sent home or people being told to stop what they're doing, and editorial decisions being made on the fly every 5 minutes. It seems to be a recipe for chaos. So while I am very much in favor of technology assisting my decision-making process, absolutely, I don't really want to be looking at the Twitter feed all day long to see how successful a story is. I'd rather be told in advance by being able to enter certain conditions. But I think we do seem to be, in some newsrooms anyway, we seem to be going down a slightly bizarre route.
So just really quickly, our newsrooms all operate with the big screen chaos alluded to there. People know exactly where things are. They have heads-up displays on the website that show how many people are reading, at what point of the website they stop reading, etc., etc. And we just see it as really important that we know as much. That doesn't mean that we don't still do things because they're right for the brand, or they make revenue, or the editor thinks it's the right thing to do, but they help us more than ever. And that, we know every month 22% of stories drive 75% of our page views. The long tail's enormous. There's an awful lot of content that's being written and is being put in a lockbox and thrown over a cliff, and nobody's seeing it. Now, whether that's because people aren't interested, or because it's not being well socialed, or it's not SEO'd properly, or it's being put out on the wrong audience spike. Understanding that we've got this long tail that isn't being seen means we can start to do something about it, and potentially some of that long tail, it will be you don't write that anymore because actually nobody cares. But only now do we know that there might be that nobody cares kind of argument to be brought into play.
So yeah, my point was really how to first understand long tail, and then how to address it, and how to make the long tail less of a long tail, right?
So we're doing pieces of work around it now to see exactly all that kind of the non-read content or the low readership content. When was it published? How was it socialed? What tagging was used on it? All that kind of information. So we can see, and it'll be a long process because we'll need to tweak it and see if that makes the dial move at all on it. And it probably just to do the audit of that long tail in each centre will take at least 2 weeks. So yeah, I'll get back to you on that when we know a bit more, but we are aware that we need to do something about it.
Yeah, story length is an obvious one. In the last couple of years, we've had a massive reduction in story length to try and address that issue of a long tail. 700 words has become 300 words. And I think that's being copied throughout other agencies as well. Not copied, but it's being done by other agencies as well, as far as I know.
All right. With that, I'll close this panel. Alison, Rachel, Paul, and Simon, thank you very much for taking the time.